Hi everyone, welcome to Mountain Home Stories. I hope you have been hearing the stories of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I've already posted 3 episodes, and today is going to be the last one, the 4th episode. If you all haven't read or heard the stories, please look into the videos in my channel, hear those stories first, and then come back to listen to today's last and final episode. A gentle reminder to all of you, if you are new to my channel, please do consider subscribing to it. And now, without wasting any further time, let's just dive into the final episode. Read along with me. Had he run away? That could only mean that Dr. Jekyll had run away. When, why, and how he had fled, Mr. Utterson could not guess. But looking at the body sprawled on the floor, another thought struck him. Had the man on the floor committed suicide? Was Dr. Jekyll involved in his death and not his victim? Mr. Poole suggested Mr. Utterson read the paper since it may throw more light on the matter. But Mr. Utterson was afraid to read it. When he did, he was surprised to find it was addressed to him. Dr. Jekyll knew that by the time Mr. Utterson read the paper, the former would have vanished, though he could not say how and why. All he was sure of was that his end was not far. He requested Mr. Utterson to go home and read the paper that Dr. Lanyon had threatened to hand over to him. If any questions remained unanswered, then he could read the confession of Dr. Jekyll. The writer signed off as, "Your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll." Mr. Utterson asked Mr. Poole if there was another paper. Mr. Poole handed over quite a bulky envelope. It was obviously very important, since it had been sealed in more than one place. Mr. Utterson slipped the packet into his pocket. He told Poole that he would not mention the paper since he wanted Dr. Jekyll's reputation to remain unsullied, even if Dr. Jekyll had escaped or died. It was 10 at night. Mr. Utterson declared that he would go home. There, in the privacy of his room, he would read the papers. He promised to be back before midnight. Then they could inform the police. The two brave men left the room and locked the door. As Mr. Utterson was leaving, he saw all the servants standing in the hall by the fireplace. He walked slowly back to his office. He was soon to read the papers that would solve the mystery. Dr. Lanyon's narrative. Once he was in his office, Mr. Utterson opened the letter written by Dr. Lanyon. It was written on 13 January that year. In it, he wrote that on the evening of 9 January, he received by post a registered letter. He recognized the handwriting on it as that of his old school friend and doctor colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll. Now, that surprised Dr. Lanyon. Although they had been friends for most of their lives, Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Lanyon hardly ever wrote to each other. Instead, as befitted two friends who lived in the same city, the two men would meet in person. They would have dinner together on occasion. In fact, he recalled, just the previous night he had had dinner with Dr. Jekyll. He thought back to their conversation but could not recall any reference or incident that would merit a letter. After all, a letter was such a formal way of keeping in touch between two old acquaintances. He was in for greater astonishment when he opened the letter and read what had been written for him. If the date at the top was to be trusted, the letter had been written on 10 December. Dr. Jekyll addressed his friend, as was expected, with a "Dear Lanyon." He went on to acknowledge that he was one of Dr. Jekyll's oldest associates, since their friendship went back to their school days. He remembered that they had, often, had differences and arguments on matters of science. However, like two mature men and two good friends, they had always agreed to disagree, and even when they were on two sides of a postulation, they had never stopped being fond of each other. There had been no rancor and no negative feeling, at least on the part of Dr. Jekyll. He added that he held Dr. Lanyon in such a high regard that, had he ever asked for help, Dr. Jekyll would have traded his life and his honor to ensure that Dr. Lanyon was safe. As he wrote the letter, however, Dr. Jekyll said that his life and reputation were all at stake and they rested upon the mercy of Dr. Lanyon. Was Dr. Jekyll doomed? He was asking Dr. Lanyon for help, and if Dr. Lanyon did not extend the same, Dr. Jekyll feared he would be lost. He knew that a man of Dr. Lanyon's intelligence and education would know, just by reading this, that Dr. Jekyll would request something society considered detestable. He left the judgment to Dr. Lanyon. Dr. Jekyll wrote that he wanted of Dr. Lanyon full attention that night, and that he should put off any more appointments that he may have fixed for the night. In fact, even if Dr. Lanyon were to be called to tend to an employer, he should not do so. Instead, he ought to pick up the letter, take a cab, and travel straight to the house of Dr. Jekyll. He requested Dr. Lanyon not to take his own carriage, since it may take time to arrive. At the house of Dr. Jekyll, the letter went on. Dr. Lanyon would be met and let in by the butler, Mr. Poole, who had his master's orders to that effect. With him would be a locksmith. They ought to, after that, open the door, even if it be by force. Once it was open, only Mr. Lanyon was to go into the room. He had permission, after all, to open a certain letter, even if it meant that the lock had to be broken. Next, he was to pull out exactly as they were found, the fourth drawer from the top. The note was so specific that it also clarified that this drawer was also the third from the bottom. Just in case the reader was wondering why the writer had taken the trouble to write so many details, there was an explanation for that too. The writer said that he was so upset and distracted that he feared that he may not be precise enough in his directions. So he was adding as many details to the instructions that he could think of, so that he left no room at all for any doubt or confusion or mistake. Even the things in the drawer would tell Dr. Lanyon that he had pulled out the correct one. It had several powders, a book, and a glass bottle of medicine. Once Dr. Lanyon was sure that he had opened the right drawer, he ought to take it just as it was found all the way back to Cavendish Square, where he lived. That would complete the first of two requests that Dr. Jekyll had for Dr. Lanyon. And another task. The second part of the request would come only after the first task was properly completed. If, as Dr. Jekyll hoped, things went as planned, Dr. Lanyon ought to be back in Dr. Jekyll's home much before the clock struck midnight hour. However, since the future is difficult to predict and Dr. Lanyon could well run into certain difficulties that could not be expected or prevented while executing the first task, Dr. Jekyll had factored in some extra time. The second task, however, had to be finished in the wee hours of the morning that same night, since that was when the servants in Dr. Jekyll's house would be sleeping, and that was exactly how Dr. Jekyll wanted it, since he did not wish them to know anything. At midnight, Dr. Lanyon was instructed to be in his consulting room. There, he would be met by a man who would give him the reference to Dr. Jekyll. He was to let the man in himself, without calling for help. He would need to hand over to this person the drawer that he had removed from the cabinet of Dr. Jekyll. That would complete all the responsibilities entrusted to Dr. Lanyon by Dr. Jekyll, for which the latter would be eternally grateful to his old friend. In a matter of 5 minutes, he would understand that this entire plan was of grave consequences. Although this may sound dramatic and exaggerated, he was told that if he neglected or failed to carry out any part of the plan, he may have to bear the guilt of causing the death of Dr. Jekyll or driving him to lose his mind. With their association of a lifetime between them, Dr. Jekyll was confident that Dr. Lanyon would take every part of his request and the plan very seriously. Just the thought that he may not made Dr. Jekyll so nervous that his hand trembled at the thought of the consequences. Dr. Jekyll did not forget to add that Dr. Lanyon should spare him a thought, since he was, just then, in an unfamiliar place, his heart saddened by extreme sorrow that no flight of the imagination could match. His only hope for some respite lay with Dr. Lanyon. If he could carry out the plan just as he had been instructed and keep to the time advised, Dr. Jekyll's suffering would soon be gone like a bad story. So he requested his dear friend to do him a favor. The letter was signed at the end, "Your friend H.J." Below was a postscript. The letter apparently had been sealed once. Then Dr. Jekyll was hit by another fear that the post office could let him down and deliver the letter only the next day, when it was all too late. But Dr. Jekyll had thought that out also. In the event of that happening, he thought it was all right for Dr. Lanyon to do the needful whenever he found some time to. the next day. The messenger would then come again the next midnight. The only catch was that it would probably be too late. If nothing terrible happened that night, Dr. Lanyon could safely guess that he would never have to set eyes on Henry Jekyll again. Was the writer sane? The reader by now was sure that his colleague was out of his mind, but Dr. Lanyon still had to wait for that to be proved to be sure. Till then, trusting that there was some sanity left in his old friend, he decided to do all he was asked to. Who, after all, could ignore an appeal like that without acting on it? Dr. Lanyon got up from the table where he had sat while reading the instructions and took a carriage. Then he went directly to Dr. Jekyll's place. As decided by Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Poole was waiting for him. He had received his instructions on the drill that evening by a registered letter that reached at the same time as the other one did Dr. Lanyon. Without wasting any time, he arranged for a carpenter and a locksmith to be there at the house. The two men reached while Dr. Lanyon and Mr. Poole were talking about what they had been instructed to do. All four of them walked together to the old surgery from where they could get into Dr. Jekyll's cabinet easily. The work was not very easy to finish since the door proved to be very strong. When it came to opening the lock, the contraption proved to be tougher than they had bargained. The carpenter warned them that although he would be able to open the door, the effort would leave the door damaged. The locksmith despaired over the intricacy of the lock. It took 2 hours of work before the lock would give way. They took out the drawer, filled it with straw and tied it in a sheet. Then off it went to the house in Cavendish Square. It was time now to look closely at what lay inside. There were packets of powders that had been packed up tidily. However, it was apparent to the expert eye that they had not been packed by a chemist, whose packaging would have been even better. That only meant one thing. They had been made and packed by Dr. Jekyll. One of the packages was opened. Inside was a white substance that appeared to be crystalline salt. The small bottle of medicine was not full. It was about half filled with a liquid that was as red in color as blood. It smelled strong and sharp. If someone knew a little bit about chemicals, it would become obvious that it had phosphorus in it, as well as some spirit. There must have been other ingredients, but those were not apparent as a cursory glance or to someone who did not know much about chemicals. The book that was also in the packet was rather commonplace. All it had in it was a long list of dates. The list went on several years. However, they stopped almost a year before the date, and rather inexplicably. At places through the list, a date would have against it a short note written by hand. In most places, the note was just one word, double. However, although there were thousands of dates, the word double could be spotted in barely 6 places. One early entry, however, had some more written next to double, total failure. What did the dates mean? What could all this mean? The date book and the few scanty notes that it held threw very light on any matter that could be fathomed by a lay person. There was also another bottle of color and sundry other things, like a record of several experiments, like several of Dr. Jekyll's other explorations, that did not seem to lead up to anything useful or valuable. Dr. Lanyon could not comprehend the importance of these sundry things. He wondered how these things reflected in any way upon the reputation, the state of mind, or the life of his friend Dr. Jekyll. Why, then, did Dr. Jekyll insist that the package be delivered by his emissary only to Dr. Lanyon? Why could it not be sent to anyone else? What was the need for so much secrecy around a package that seemed entirely innocuous? The more the doctor thought things over, the more he told himself that the entire episode was linked to a diseased mind. This could turn something that appeared innocent into an incident that was risky. He asked his servants to retire for the day. Then he decided he needed to provide for some kind of self-defense, and so he took out an old revolver that he had and loaded it with bullets. The clocks of London tolled. It was the hour of midnight, the hour when more actions could be expected according to the letter. As if on cue and exactly on time, someone lifted the knocker on the door and announced his arrival. As he had been instructed, Dr. Lanyon himself went to answer the door. When he opened it, he saw a short man. The unusual visitor was bent, almost as if he was hiding, taking the help of columns at the doorway. Although he knew where the man was coming from, Dr. Lanyon still asked him, to be doubly sure, if he had been sent by Dr. Jekyll. Seeming rather awkward to be meeting Dr. Lanyon, the man said he had been sent by Dr. Jekyll. Dr. Lanyon asked him to enter the house. Before the man stepped in, he took a furtive glance over his shoulder at the dark plaza behind him from where he had just come. They noticed a vigilant policeman coming down. The sight of a man of the law made the visitor jump, and he did not hesitate any more from entering the room. Dr. Lanyon could not help but notice the strange behavior of the unnamed visitor, and he did not think very highly of the man's reactions. The man went in and began to walk ahead of Dr. Lanyon into the consulting room. They entered the doctor's consulting room, which was bright with lights. Dr. Lanyon was uncomfortable with his visitor, so he placed a careful hand on the revolver. The clear lights of the room helped Dr. Lanyon take in the visitor. He knew for sure that he had never seen him before. The man, as he had already noticed, was small in build. But what dawned on Dr. Lanyon was the strange and dreadful look on his face. He was very obviously more disturbed by something in the vicinity. He also looked like he was ill, and the muscles in the face twitched. He seemed to be a strong man, but he also looked as if he was feeling ill and faint. Dr. Lanyon noticed, but then he ascribed it to characteristic revulsions or dislike. He could not help wonder how intense the shakes were. However, time is a great teacher, and the events that happened after that led Dr. Lanyon to conclude that his looks and his strange behavior were caused by something that lay deep within him. Although Dr. Lanyon was intrigued by the man, he was also disgusted by him. He noticed that the man's sense of dress was also strange and indeed rather ludicrous. The clothes had been made out of expensive cloth. Their colors were restrained, but they were far too large for him from every aspect. The trousers, for instance, were so long that he had tucked in the ends so that they would not sweep the floor or trip him. The coat he was wearing was far too large and long for a man of his size. The waist of the coat crept down far below where it should have ended. Its collar was wide open, since it was not cut to his size. At other times and in other places, other people may have laughed at such ridiculous attire, but not Dr. Lanyon. He took in all the details and came to the conclusion that there was some major aberration in the man. The man filled him with dread and a sense of doom. Dr. Lanyon was disgusted by him, and yet he watched him, riveted. He was sure now that the man meant no good. Indeed, there was something evil about him. He tried to judge for himself the strange emissary from his friend Dr. Jekyll. Who was this man? Where did he come from? What did he do for a living? What was his background? Such disturbing and pointed thoughts ran through Dr. Lanyon's mind as he studied his visitor closely. Why was the man so keyed up? The man was certainly excitable. He asked Dr. Lanyon most impatiently if he had got what he had come for. The man was so agitated that he clutched Dr. Lanyon's arm as if to shake him up and convey to him the urgency of why he was there. Dr. Lanyon did not much like that. He pushed him back because the man's touch made his blood run cold. He reminded him, albeit politely and addressing him with respect, that the man had not yet introduced himself. He then asked him to sit down, if he so wished. Dr. Lanyon himself took the usual chair that he sat in when meeting a patient. He tried to be as normal as he could manage to and push out of his mind how unusually late at night it was for a visitor, how worried he was, processing all the thoughts that had crossed his mind and the revulsion that he felt towards the man. Gulp of magic. At that, the visitor's tone changed. He apologized and requested Dr. Lanyon to forgive him. He blamed his impolite behavior on his impatience. He said that he had been sent to Dr. Lanyon by the friend of the latter, Dr. Henry Jekyll. The reason was important. To control his emotions, he touched his throat, and Dr. Lanyon could make out that he was bordering a panic. Then he mentioned the drawer. By now, Dr. Lanyon, convinced this was indeed the person he had been waiting for, and so he pointed out the drawer that was lying on the ground at the back of a table. The sheet was still on it. The man jumped up and ran to it. He stopped and placed a hand on his heart to calm himself down. He was so nervous that Dr. Lanyon could make out that he was gnashing his jaws and grating his teeth. The tension showed on his face that was so pale that Dr. Lanyon feared the man would faint or lose his mind. Asked to calm down, the man turned to Dr. Lanyon with a smile that was born out of anguish. He drew the sheet off. When he looked at what lay inside the drawer, he howled with relief. By now, Dr. Lanyon was scared stiff. Composing himself a little, the man asked Dr. Lanyon for a graduated glass to measure liquid. Dr. Lanyon got up from his chair. Walking slowly, he handed over the graduated glass. The man smiled as if to thank Dr. Lanyon. He mixed a little of the red medicine and a powder. In front of his eyes, the mixture began to change color. From light red, it began to get brighter, and they could hear the bubbles. Out of the glass rose small clouds of mist. Abruptly, the solution was quiet. Its color became dark purple and then a pale green. The man had been observing the changes very closely. Once they were done, he smiled and put the glass on the table. Then he turned to study Dr. Lanyon. He said that only one part needed to be decided. Would Dr. Lanyon listen to the man and be wise? Would he permit the man to leave the house with the glass and not ask any questions? Or would he allow curiosity to get the better of his common sense? He advised him to give his answer careful thought, since it would be an important question and things would happen as he wished. If he let him leave, the man would, leaving Dr. Lanyon just as he had been before he had helped a man in dire straits. On the other hand, if he so wanted, he could learn something new and become famous and powerful. Lanyon pretends to be calm. Dr. Lanyon was nervous, but he pretended to be calm and collected. He could not but take things to the logical conclusion, so Dr. Lanyon had to decide whether it should be in his house or whether the man could leave. Since Dr. Lanyon did not want the man to leave, he reminded the doctor of his medical vows that swore him to secrecy. And as Dr. Lanyon watched and stood witness, the man took in the liquid from the measured glass in one swig. He cried out, tottered, stumbled, and held on to the table. His eyes looked strange and he gasped, mouth wide open. There, in front of the startled eyes of Dr. Lanyon, strange changes began to happen. The man's face began to swell out. The face turned black. His nose, eyes, and mouth seemed to melt and change. It was so terrifying that Dr. Lanyon jumped up from his chair in alarm. He ran to the wall for support and shelter, and raised his arm to protect himself from the strange man. He screamed out to God because he could not believe what he was witness to. The strange man, now pale and pathetic, had turned into Dr. Henry Jekyll. They talked for an hour, but Dr. Lanyon could not get himself to write down their discussions. He felt sick at what he had just witnessed. As time passed and the sharpness of immediate memory began to get a little blunt, he asked himself if he was imagining things. Could he believe himself? Dr. Lanyon had no answer. The choice to know more had been a costly one for Dr. Lanyon. If only he had let the strange man take the liquid out of the house. Now, after seeing the transformation, his entire life had changed. He could not sleep. He would sit up all day and through the night, terrified. He knew then that he would not live long. But when he died, he would go skeptical and disbelieving. Dr. Jekyll had confided in him deeds that he had done, and his conduct would have shocked society's sense of justice and good morals. Although Dr. Jekyll cried in remorse, it was too horrifying for Dr. Lanyon to even think about it without feeling revulsed and shocked. Dr. Lanyon had just one thing more to share with Mr. Utterson, who, he doubted, would believe it. The man who had entered his house that night furtively and had turned into Dr. Jekyll had confessed that in his appearance as the small, distasteful man was known as Mr. Hyde. A search warrant was out for him for the murder of Mr. Carew. The letter was signed, Hasty Lanyon. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Henry Jekyll wrote in the letter that he had left for Mr. Utterson that he was born in the 19th century to a wealthy family. The family was hard-working, respected wisdom, and honored the good. There was no reason a child born into this family should not grow up to an illustrious future. When he was young, the healthy Henry Jekyll was impatient and cheerful. He found it difficult, as was expected of someone from his lineage, to be serious in public. So he began to hide what made him happy. This dichotomy troubled him for years. He began to compare himself with others and knew that he must lead a double life. There was one part of himself that he was ashamed of, but the severity of his judgment was probably because he was an idealist and was strict with himself, and thus, hiding his frivolous nature, he learned to live a double life, one in public and the other in private. By the time he was fully grown, he found himself leading a dual life, in which his better side constantly felt guilt for the transgressions of his darker side. When his scientific interest led to mystical studies as to the divided nature of man, he hoped to find some solution to his own split nature. Jekyll insisted that man is not truly one, but truly two, and he recorded how he dreamed of separating the good and evil natures. There was, from childhood, a side to him that the strict morals of his times would have found unpalatable, so he began more and more to couch that. As he began to study science, he realized that in this sphere lay certain possibilities that could help him lead his dual existence. He tried hard to find some answer to why he was the way he was. He realized then that each of us is not just one person, but two. He had totally separated the kind and the cruel, the good from the evil. His thorough research led him to come up with a chemical solution. This, he found, was the answer to some problems that his dual personalities were causing. Although he had risked his life, he hoped that his hunch would lead him to a major discovery. When he drank the solution, he felt terrible pain and he also felt nauseous. But this did not last long. In its place, the strong, big-built Dr. Jekyll had turned into the small Mr. Hyde. Yet, he felt extremely strong and brash. Mr. Hyde was small because his evil deeds made him feel small. One would believe that when Dr. Jekyll turned to a mirror and saw Mr. Hyde, he would be appalled. On the contrary, Dr. Jekyll had been beside himself with joy at seeing the persona that was so different from his own self. Soon, this double life became his regular existence, and he was delighted to turn into Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll found his alter ego in Mr. Hyde. Since Dr. Jekyll was much older, he could not do what he wanted to. On the other hand, the younger Mr. Hyde would go out and sow his wild oats. The serious Dr. Jekyll found in Mr. Hyde a happy release from the discretions of his public life and a release for his passions. Not only did Dr. Jekyll regularly transform himself into another man, he created another life to make the second person seem as real as he could. Dr. Jekyll hired a house and furnished it. That was why, although the neighborhood was dingy, Mr. Utterson had noticed that the house in Soho was tastefully decorated. He began to enjoy living in the life of Mr. Hyde. He opened a bank account in the name of Mr. Hyde. As he grew more confident, Mr. Hyde's misdoings fell to lower depths. So much detail and thought did Dr. Jekyll give the character of his alter ego that indeed Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were two people, and Dr. Jekyll was thoroughly ashamed of what Mr. Hyde did. Even when he returned to being Dr. Jekyll, the doctor did not feel a twinge of remorse at what Hyde did. However, if he harmed anyone, he did attempt to make amends on his behalf. 2 months after Mr. Carew was murdered, Dr. Jekyll was a worried man. As he slept one night, he turned into Mr. Hyde, although he had not taken any of the magical solution. He woke up to find himself as Mr. Hyde. Now he was sure that he should not keep changing himself into Mr. Hyde. There was a possibility, he knew, that one day he may not be able to turn back to Dr. Jekyll. He would have to live forever as Mr. Hyde. 2 more months as Dr. Jekyll, and he was pining to go back to being Mr. Hyde. Since he had been inhibited for so long this time, Mr. Hyde was more evil, wild, and brutal than he had ever been. It was in his belligerent mood that he attacked Carew and beat him to death. Mr. Hyde being an evil man, he was thrilled with what he had done. Hyde did not feel any twinge of guilt or any pity for the brutal way he had treated the elderly gentleman. On the other hand, Dr. Jekyll felt extremely guilty about what his alter ego had done. He admitted it was a gruesome crime. He got down on his knees and prayed to God that Mr. Hyde be forgiven for his sin. The murder was so gruesome that Dr. Jekyll decided he would never transform himself into Mr. Hyde again. As the months went by, Mr. Utterson and his other friends observed and pointed out that Dr. Jekyll looked more relieved. He seemed very well once again. But being good all the time could be most boring. Dr. Jekyll got bored with being good and went back to some of his wicked ways, but this time he wanted to do the wrong things as Dr. Jekyll, not as Mr. Hyde. This time, even without taking the solution and just by wanting to be Mr. Hyde, he could be him. This happened one day just as Dr. Jekyll was visiting a garden. All his insecurities and hesitations went the moment he became Mr. Hyde. He found the courage that Dr. Jekyll seldom had. However, another scary thought struck him. The police believed that Mr. Hyde had killed Mr. Carew and were looking for him. So, they would catch him since he was in a public place. What was he to do? How could he turn back into Dr. Jekyll right then and there? Only the magic liquid could do that, and that was lying in his room, far from where he was. He would surely be spotted and caught on his way back. That is why he sent a message to Dr. Lanyon to go into his laboratory and pick up the magical stuff for him. The magic of the liquid seemed to be wearing off. It often does in most other pleasures. He soon found that he was changing from one to the other form because the effect of the potion was wearing off. From that night onwards, he had to take double the previous quantity and repeat the medicine every 6 hours. If he forgot to take the chemical, he would be transformed into the alter ego automatically. As the reader may recall, he had once had to withdraw from the window when Messrs. Enfield and Utterson were speaking to him. As the world closed in upon him, Hyde began to gain in strength. Dr. Jekyll, on the other hand, began to fade away. Gradually, after having made the potion so many times, Dr. Jekyll found that he had used up most of the salt that he needed to make the mixture. The next consignment that he ordered did not have the same results. So what had happened that was different? Dr. Jekyll understood that there was some impurity in the first chemical that he had used that brought about the magical effect. That meant Dr. Jekyll would soon become forever Mr. Hyde. As he emptied the magic liquid into himself, he had just enough time to write the letter explaining all. Dr. Jekyll did not know how Mr. Hyde would fare. Perhaps he would kill himself, or perhaps the police would arrest him. The only thing he knew for sure was that by the time Mr. Utterson read the letter, Dr. Henry Jekyll would be gone forever. And thus ended the story of one of the strangest lives ever lived. I hope you enjoyed hearing this wonderful story as much as I enjoyed reading it out to you. I'll be coming back with another story very soon, another genre. Please leave me a comment and let me know how you like this story and give me your suggestions as well. Please do like and share, and of course subscribe to my channel if you are new to it. Hit on the notification bell for my next videos, and thank you so much for dropping by. Come back to hear me again. Till then, take care and bye-bye.